everybody. Thank you for coming. We're very lucky today to have Professor Kari here from the Norwegian School of Sports Science in Oslo from Norway. So Kari got her doctorate in 1990 and was appointed Professor of Exercise Science and Physiotherapy in 1997. She was elected head of the Norwegian School of Sports Sciences in Oslo and was the first president of the International Association for Physical Therapists in Women's Health. She has been the Vice President of the Norwegian Council for Physical Activity for 8 years and giving direct advice to the Norwegian Minister of Health on physical activity, fitness and in health. In addition, she's been the Vice President of the Norwegian Physiotherapy Association subgroup for sports physiotherapy and is a board member of the Pelvic Floor Centre at
Akershus
University Hospital in Norway. She's published over 260 scientific papers on pelvic floor dysfunction, treatment of incontinence, low back and pelvic girdle pain, exercise during pregnancy, after childbirth, measurement methodology, fitness and women's health, and has given over 260 invited international keynote presentations. So we're very lucky. She's published numerous articles, DVDs, videos and books on pelvic floor, fitness, pregnancy and physical activity. She's been a visiting fellow to Stanford and a guest professor at the University of Dunedin in New Zealand, University of Melbourne, Australia, and in the Ministry of Health in Singapore. She's an honorary member of the Norwegian Physiotherapy Association of Women's Health and the Brazilian Physiotherapy Association of Women's Health. One of her RCTs on pelvic floor muscle training was awarded the 15 top trials in physiotherapy among over 25,000 studies in the pelvic floor database. She was awarded
the PEDRO database, which is
database.
Physiotherapy database.
Yeah. She's awarded the Mildred Elson Award, the most prestigious award from the World Confederation of Physiotherapy, for her contributions to research and education in pelvic floor dysfunction. In 2016, she was awarded the International Continence Society Lifelong Achievement Award for her research and education on pelvic floor and incontinence. So I think we're very lucky. Welcome, Kari. Thank you.
Thank you so much. Gives a lot of pressure on me. So thank you so much. It's been really a great pleasure for me to come here and to work with Jenny, because we share this common interest in exercise and the pelvic floor. So this has been such a great opportunity for me to be here. So just to say where I'm coming from, this is the Norwegian School of Sports Sciences, and you can see this is exactly how it is nowadays, with a lot of snow in Oslo. And I also work with the 20% position at the Akershus University Hospital, which is here. I just saw the advertisement for this university, and you are doing very well when it comes to international rankings. I saw this big banner, so now I have to say also about my university, because we are a specialized university in sports. It's a small university, but we had a Shanghai Global Ranking of universities with more than 350 sport universities, and we are ranked #1 in the Nordic countries, which are 5 different countries, and #2 in Europe and #3 worldwide. So that's just to say that we are also doing some good research at this university. So the topic for today is really into women's health and lifelong physical activity, because we know that this is very important for women throughout the lifespan to be physically active. It's preventing osteoporosis, it's very good for mental health, it's good for preventing and treating cancers, musculoskeletal diseases. But what about the pelvic floor? And I know that some of you are not familiar with the pelvic floor, so this may be quite difficult maybe to understand, but this is actually me standing like this. So this is the symphysis here, and then my tailbone, and the pelvic floor is underneath. And this is from the back, so you can see the pelvic floor from underneath, but more easier if you all stand up. And if you cup your hands like this, and this is actually looking down at your pelvic floor inside the pelvis. This is how it looks like. So if you open up a bit, and then you have the levator hiatus here, and then you have the urethra, the vagina, and the rectum underneath. is almost as thick as my fingers, 1 centimeter. And if you can go to your neighbor, and if I can borrow, well, two, yeah, I just borrow you. And if you put some pressure and then you can hold back now, this is what your pelvic floor must do when you are moving. So then you are increasing the intra-abdominal pressure, but also you have increased pressure from the floor. So the poor pelvic floor muscles, they are in between, shaking and trying their best to keep up so we are not leaking. So it's not opening up and we are leaking, or we are getting prolapse throughout this opening, which is the biggest hernia port in the body. So it may fall out like that. That's it. So now you know where the pelvic floor is. So in 2004, I proposed the 2 different hypotheses on the pelvic floor and exercise. And the first hypothesis is that general exercise training strengthens the pelvic floor muscles and decreases the levator hiatus, so it's narrowing the opening. This would lead to less urinary incontinence, less fecal incontinence, and less pelvic organ prolapse. But it would also maybe have a negative influence on vaginal delivery because it will be tighter and then maybe it's more difficult to give birth. The other hypothesis is that general exercise training overloads, stretches, and weakens the pelvic floor. And that would give more urinary incontinence, more fecal incontinence, and more pelvic organ prolapse. But it maybe then give easier birth because it's opening up and it's hanging down and it's easier to get the baby out. So these hypotheses are going in totally different directions. So what do we know about these 2 hypotheses today? So what about general fitness activities? Well, there are huge epidemiological studies showing that physically active women report less urinary incontinence. However, these are, as you know, cross-sectional studies, and it's really difficult to say who's in the studies. There may be selection bias, and probably based on the hen and the egg problem. So are they dry because they exercise, or do they exercise because they are dry? So the common scientific question. And maybe if there is an association here, is this going via weight reduction? Because if you are overweight, you may also be in high risk of having urinary incontinence. So we don't know that. So if we look at hypothesis 1, female athletes have strong pelvic floor muscles. The theory behind that would be that general physical activity increases pelvic floor muscle strength via the stretch and fatigue and the facilitation or contraction of the pelvic floor muscles. And this co-contraction with other muscle groups and increase in intra-abdominal pressure may strengthen the muscles. That would be some sort of a logical thing to think that, well, any exercise is good and also pelvic floor muscles will react positively on exercise. However, if we look at CrossFit participants and compare them with recreationally active women and look at the pelvic floor muscle strength, and this study was done with 35 healthy nulliparous CrossFit women, and they had done CrossFit for at least 6 months or 3 times per week, and they were compared with 35 recreationally active women, meaning they were not exercising regularly, but maybe just walking, being active, but not really training, not exercise training. They found that there were no differences in the maximal vaginal descent, the vaginal resting pressure, or pelvic floor muscle strength in any of these groups. And there are, in fact, very few studies on the strength of elite athletes and compared to normals. We'll see another one later on. And there is a high prevalence of urinary incontinence in women participating in regular physical activity. So we did the first study, I think, worldwide on this back in 1989, and we found that 26% of the students at our university reported urinary incontinence. This study was also done in Norway, and we've asked women who had urinary incontinence if they were active and why they were not active. And 2/3 of them said that it was because of the urinary incontinence that they had withdrawn from being physically active. This study from the US, from Ingrid Nygaard, 33% of exercises reported urinary incontinence. From Australia, 40% of mid-aged women exercising, and 30% of them avoided sporting activities. And young and middle-aged women from Italy, 15% in that study. From Austria, 49% of exercises. And this study again from our group in Norway, 26% of group fitness instructors reported to have urinary incontinence. And even it was the same in Pilates and yoga instructors who really try to promote that they are actually doing these exercises during their training sessions. And in the study from Brazil, 24% versus 14% in the control group compared to the gym participants. And the last one that I have seen, 49.3% among women attending gyms and exercise classes here. So it's quite huge. And this is only, regular exercises. These are the athletes. And we can see that there is huge numbers in the athletes, with the highest in those who are doing trampoline jumping. And you may think it's when they're landing. It's not. That's not where they're leaking. They are leaking when they are doing the big things up there. And when they are rehearsing for new vaults, new things to do, that's when they leak. But it's very high, and especially high in those who are doing high impact activities, meaning that it's running and jumping, landing, especially like in the gymnasts. And then what about anal incontinence? This is also quite common. 6.6 to 14% have this troublesome condition after childbirth. And if they have been very unlucky and had an anal sphincter rupture during their childbirth, the vaginal childbirth, 20 to 50% may have this terrible incontinence. In this study from Norway, we didn't find that any of the athletes in this study, comparing athletes with normal active women, had anal incontinence. But in this study from France, 14.8% of the athletes aged 18 to 40 years old versus 4.9% in the control group reported this condition. But most of it was flatus, so it was not solid stool leakage. And this is the only study that I have found looking into prolapse in women. And this was from the US. This was an internet survey looking at 311 women. We do not know the response rate because it's an internet survey, so that makes it difficult. But they were exercising between 8 to 12 hours per week. And they found that stress urinary incontinence was 38.4%. Urgency urinary incontinence, which is when you're not reaching the toilet, you have this strong urge to void and you cannot reach the toilet before you leak. 16%, the same as what we found by the Norwegian athletes. Anal incontinence, 28%, and pelvic organ prolapse, 5%. And then pelvic girdle pain was 18%. In this group, 24% had at least one arm of the female athlete triad with disordered eating, menstrual irregularities, or osteoporosis, or combination of this. And then the athletic triad was not associated with pelvic floor dysfunction in this group, and stress urinary incontinence and pelvic organ prolapse was more common in parous women, which is what we also find in other studies. So what would be the possible predisposing risk factor for pelvic floor dysfunctions in nulliparous females? Because when you look into these prevalent studies, most of these young athletes have not had any children. So that could be a connective tissue abnormality, like you can see in this one, that she has really, she can press the thumb towards her lower arm. I'm far from being incontinent, I think, looking at this. And we also have other tests where they really can show a big difference in this. So that may be one reason, because then it's sort of hanging down. It's not really high up inside the pelvis, the pelvic floor muscles. There may be muscular factors like the dimensions of the levator hiatus, the opening, location of the muscles inside the pelvis, total number of muscle cells, distribution of slow and fast twitch fibers within the pelvic floor muscle may differ from female to female. And there may be neurophysiological factors like the coordination and the timing and the speed of the contraction, and also the strength of the muscles may differ. So then we have some very good studies coming out from this university, from Jenny's group. You looked into the morphology in the female athletes and compared them with controls, and did MRI in 10 athletes and 10 age-matched controls. And you didn't find any difference in the size of the pelvis, which is very important to control for, I think, in this. And no difference in the urogenital hiatus, which is not the same as the levator hiatus, but it's a measure of some of the same. But you found that we're 20% higher cross-sectional area of the pelvic floor muscles in the athletes. And then you speculate that this may give a prolonged labor. And this was followed up by another study with 24 nulliparous elite athletes, and they had been at least 5 years at national or international standard, and all were involving in high impact activity sport. And they were compared to 25 age and BMI matched control. This is a very good study, 3 and 4D ultrasonography. And the results show that there was higher muscle diameter in the athletes, so it's really conferring the former results. There was a larger levator hiatus area on Valsalva, which we would think would be the opposite, but it was interesting, we found the same. And there was also the greater bladder descent on Valsalva in the athletes. And no significant difference on the hiatal area at rest or during pelvic floor muscle contraction. So then we did this study that was just published in the American Journal of Obstetrics and Gynecology. We asked the question, do regular exercises have stronger pelvic floor muscles than non-regular exercises during pregnancy? And we compared vaginal resting pressure, pelvic floor muscle function strength, and endurance at mid-pregnancy, and between regular versus non-regular exercises. And these were regular Norwegian first-time pregnant women. The exercises were those participating in regular exercise training equal to or more than 30 minutes 3 times per week, and the non-exercises did not do any regular exercises. They may be walking and doing recreational activities, but non-regular exercise. And they were 28.7 years old, and the pre-pregnancy body mass was 23.9 in this group. And this is how we are measuring the function of the pelvic floor. So we look at the resting pressure, as you can see here, from atmospheric pressure and up to this line, and then 3 maximum voluntary contractions, and then some resting period, and then we are assessing for 10 seconds the area under the curve as an estimate of the muscle endurance. And yeah, that's it. And we found that exercises have statistically significantly stronger and more endurant pelvic floor muscles than the non-exercises. So we are still on hypothesis 1. The mean difference was 6.4 centimeter of water and 39 for the endurance. And then we did adjusted linear regression analysis, looking into pre-pregnancy BMI, age, education, smoking during pregnancy, and most important, regular pelvic floor muscle training during pregnancy. And pelvic floor muscle strength was still significant, but not endurance. When we looked into these 2 groups, there were no differences in urinary incontinence between the 2 groups. But when we did adjusted linear regression analysis exploring the association between urinary incontinence and the function of the pelvic floor, again, this was an inverse negative association. So those who had stronger pelvic floor were continent. So it's not the exercises itself, it's the fact that you have stronger pelvic floor muscles that are saying that you are continent and not vice versa. And this study also looked into general exercises. It's the same group if that affect the opening, the levator hiatus area. And the same group, as I said, if we asked them, looked at those who did not, who were exercising during pregnancy, there were no significant difference in the area at week 21 or 37 during pregnancy. Those who were exercising at week 21, still no difference between exercises and non-exercises. But in exercise, when we asked about exercise at week 37, so quite late in pregnancy is 40 weeks, so they are just about to give birth. And this will be actually the real exercises, because if you exercise 3 weeks before you give birth, then you are like Jenny and me, then you really love exercise and you do it. So they are exercising. Then we found that they had significantly larger levator hiatus area. So it's the same as you found actually here. So they may have stronger muscles and they may have higher cross-sectional area, but the levator hiatus is wider, which is good when you're giving birth. And we also looked at this for the whole group of women following them during pregnancy and found that this is happening by itself during pregnancy. This is a preparation for birth coming from the nature itself. It's opening up, which is very good for us. And then the big question has always been, especially among physiotherapists and I think also midwives, well, should they train the pelvic floor during pregnancy, because that may tighten up the muscles and it may give more difficult birth. And that's of course very important to find out. But now we are lucky because we have a lot of studies in this area, both randomized control trials and also cohort studies. And this is a systematic review on 12 RCTs involving 2,243 first-time pregnant women. And they lasted from exercise during gestational week 8 until 20. And they lasted from 8 to 20 weeks, and they started at gestational week 20, all of them. They found, and this is really good again, that if you are exercising your pelvic floor muscles during pregnancy, you significantly shortens the first stage of labor with a mean 28 minutes, and the second stage with a mean 10 minutes, which is very, very good. And antenatal pelvic floor muscle training does not increase the risk of episiotomy, instrumental vaginal delivery, and perineal laceration in pre-gravida. So this is really good news. Train the pelvic floor during pregnancy. It doesn't hurt your ability to have a vaginal birth, and we also know that it can prevent urinary incontinence. And I was head of this IOC, the International Olympic Committee consensus on effect of strenuous exercises on the fetus, labor and birth. And we looked into the literature and found that birth weights of exercising women are less likely to be more than 4,000 grams and not at increased risk of being less than 2,500 grams, which is good. Exercise does not increase the risk of preterm birth. This is general exercise. It's not linked to risk of induction in epidural, episiotomy or perineal tears, forceps or vacuum delivery. And the first stage of labor, as I already said, before full dilatation may be shorter in exercising women. This is general exercises. And exercise throughout pregnancy may reduce the cesarean section rate. That's a very difficult measure because this really is the different politics in different hospitals and in different countries. In my hospital we have a cesarean rate of 16%, and in Brazil I think it's like 60 something. So it's depends on the politics of the country that you are in. So what is the conclusion on hypothesis 1? Does general physical activity train the pelvic floor muscles? There are few studies on pelvic floor muscle strength, so we don't really know. There is no evidence that athletic women have stronger pelvic floor muscles, and you will see soon another study on that. Physical activity does not seem to protect against urinary incontinence. There is no evidence that athletes have more difficult birth. And there is some evidence that general exercise and pelvic floor muscle training can reduce the first and the second stage of labor. And then hypothesis 2, pelvic floor physical activity may overload, stretch and weaken the pelvic floor muscles. And the risk sport for this hypothesis has always been weightlifting and marathon running. And we do not have studies actually in that. We have in running, but not in weightlifting as far as I know. So this is the other study that has measured pelvic floor muscle strength in athletes and compared to others. So these were 10 volleyball players, 10 basketball players, 10 handball players, and 10 controls. And there was statistically significant difference between the volley and basketball players and control. And as you can see, the athletes had weaker muscles than the controls in this study. It's a very small study, but it's the only one we have for the moment. And they found, and this has been shown in many studies, that low pelvic floor muscle strength is that correlates with symptoms of urinary incontinence. And this study is interesting because it's asked the question, can high impact activities cause stress urinary incontinence and pelvic organ prolapse? And it was done in the US. 116 nulliparous women with a mean age of 20.7 years were examined with POPQ, that's actually assessing whether you have pelvic organ prolapse or not. And a questionnaire before and after 6 weeks of summer military training. And I guess that's quite hard training for these women in the US. And they found that among the paratroopers, and they were only 37, they were significantly more likely to have stage 2 prolapse and worsening of the pelvic support regardless of the initial prolapse stage. So they were assessed before and after 6 weeks of training. And there were no association in this study with urinary incontinence and paratrooper training. I tried to find studies, and it's been very difficult to look at what's actually happening to the pelvic floor when you're doing physical activities. Most of them have assessed intra-abdominal pressure, and this study it's a book on exercises from Hay in '93, showing just the times your body weight that the pelvic floor muscle has to resist when you're doing these different activities. And I don't know if you know this girl, but this is a Norwegian Olympic champion from Sydney Olympics, Trine Solberg. That's what's happening to her javelin throwing when the lead foot, when she is throwing the javelin. So it's quite a big impact that the pelvic floor needs to resist or counteract. And this very old study, actually one of them from our university, Eie in '71, trying to assess what happens during the different activities. And you can see like the sit-ups is quite low compared to sneezing, for instance. And I don't know if you know what this is, because this is the country of, cross-country skiing. This is going like this when you ski. So that's what's happening to the intra-abdominal pressure. So this is what the pelvic floor muscle need to counteract. Some newer studies on this coming up now. This is a study with 90 women from a group training class. And 25% of them were found to be unable to contract the pelvic floor muscles. 60% of them had stress urinary incontinence. And all displayed bladder-based depression on abdominal curl. So they were assessed with ultrasonography, and it was a pressure downwards when they were doing abdominal curls like this. But there were no difference between the urinary incontinent ones and the continent. And parous women had a higher descent than the nulliparous, which is expected. And then the question has always been, should women do, with urinary incontinence and pelvic organ prolapse, do abdominal curls? And in this study, 30 women with urinary incontinence and pelvic organ prolapse were assessed. And they found that the intra-abdominal pressure increased when doing a curl from 19.6 and up to 50. But this was actually lower than what you're doing when you're doing a cough. So it's not that high. And this study with 30 women performed 3 repetitions of different activities with measurement of abdominal pressure. And again, they found out that the sit-up was approximately the same as standing up from a chair. And I don't think we would say that women should stop rising from a chair, but some are really advising women not to do any sit-ups, and I'm not in that group. So conclusion, abdominal crunches, climbing stairs, walking on a treadmill, and many lifting activities did not increase abdominal pressure significantly more than standing up from a chair. And then this again from the US, 12 healthy women, again measured with the intra-abdominal pressure and finding the same, that abdominal exercises were less than 100 centimeters of water, and the same as when you laugh, cough, or bearing down in sitting position. And interesting for a physiotherapist is that holding breath or exhaling did not influence on the intra-abdominal pressure during exercises. So it's not dangerous to hold your breath for a couple of seconds when you do exercises. I think that's also an important message. And this study, differences in intra-abdominal pressure between pelvic floor safe and conventional versions of exercises. I just got hold of this while I was here. So again, a very good study from the group here. 53 asymptomatic women, mean age 39 years old. And it was a comparison of 10 pair of exercises and controlled for age, BMI, and parity. And these results show that it was a significant difference in treadmill. So running versus walking, cycling, standing cycling versus sitting cycling, and lunges, wide lunges with weights and versus narrow lunges. Shoulder press, I was not sure what you were doing there in differences.
Shoulder press.
Okay, with weight? Or, yeah. And step-ups. So that showed significantly differences, but these other exercises did not show any differences, as far as I understood. So you conclude that performing the recommended pelvic floor safe version instead of the discouraged conventional versions of the exercises may not necessarily protect the pelvic floor and vice versa. And I think this is very important for us to find out what will be too much for the pelvic floor, and how can we advise women to do other exercises if they have a problem with leakage or pelvic organ prolapse. And this study from Denmark looked at daily activities. This was before and after pelvic organ prolapse surgery. And they found that vaginal pressure was 4 to 5 times higher during coughing and Valsalva than during lifting. And this has been the advice to these patients after surgery, that they shouldn't lift, but actually they say that we should reconsider, because post-operative care should focus more on treating chronic cough and constipation than I was trying to avoid these small lifting activities. We did one study on one bout of strenuous exercise and whether that would cause pelvic floor muscle fatigue. And we looked at young nulliparous women, but they all had stress urinary incontinence symptoms. And we measured, as I had shown earlier, the maximal voluntary contraction, vaginal resting pressure, and the holding time. And this is the protocol, and this was my master students and me following this participant, and it was a horrible exercise session. As you can see, 90 minutes, They were absolutely exhausted afterwards doing these things. So I'm glad we only did it for one day and not repeating. So I don't think they would come back. So I don't think they could actually walk the next day. But anyway, this is what we did. And we found that there was a 17% decrease in maximum voluntary contraction after this 90 minutes of exercises. But there were no change in resting pressure or the holding time, so the endurance. But the ability to contract maximally was affected on the exercise. But does it matter in the long term if they leak while they are gymnasts or doing exercises? In this long-term follow-up study from the US, Ingrid Niger followed them for 20 years, the former Olympians, and they didn't find any difference between the gymnast and the track and field, that was the high-impact activities, compared to the swimmers when it comes to urinary incontinence later in life. And we did a 15-year follow-up of former elite athletes and controls in Norway, and these were also at the Olympic level. And former elite athletes were not more likely to experience urinary incontinence later in life compared to the controls, which is good. And former high-impact activities did not influence the prevalence of urinary incontinence later in life, the same as was found in the US study. However, having urinary incontinence early in life experienced during sport is strongly associated with urinary incontinence later in life. So if you have this at an early stage in life before you have children, you are at risk of having it later in life. And this study from the trampolinists in Sweden, they found that 76% of the women with leakage during trampolining continued to leak after ending competitive sport. So that's really in opposition to what the two other studies found. And the prevalence of current leakage was higher in ex-trampolinists than in the reference group. But this was not really a matched group, so I don't think it's a very, very strong study. But again, it shows that there are the studies are not showing the same results. They're going in both directions. So to conclude on hypothesis 2, does strenuous physical activity weaken the pelvic floor? I don't think we know, but I would say that it may be possible. So what can we do? What about prevention and treatment of stress urinary incontinence in female elite athletes? We know that this is very effective in the general population, but can we really treat these women who have this really high impact on the pelvic floor? That's another question. First of all then, before we start doing anything, does it affect the athletes at all? Do they care? Is it a problem for them? And in this study from, again, Sweden, the trampolinist, they found that 61% of them were having urinary leakage when trampolining. 72% had discussed it with somebody, meaning 30% did not talk to anyone. 35% said it affected their daily lives. 53% that it affected them psychologically, and 12% stopped because of the leakage. And 157 athletes were asked in France about this, and they have a very low response rate, unfortunately, but they said that even a small quantity of urine loss reported to be embarrassing, and 84% of them had not spoken about it, so they didn't tell anyone. This study looked at 106 track and field, basket and indoor football athletes in Portugal, and they reported that they felt concerned, annoyed, frustrated and afraid for new episodes, and that it affected the performance but not activity of daily life. But that it affects the performance is of course very important for an athlete. So what do we know about prevention and treatment of this specific group? This is a very small study from Denmark. They looked at 6 women with stress urinary incontinence, so they were not athletes, but they performed an aerobic exercise class for 30 minutes with and without the vaginal sponge in situ. And they found that there were no leakage in those who had, when they used this sponge. So that sort of it keeps the urethra closed and higher up. In my clinical experience, I think about 50% of women react like that, but the rest does not. So I think it can work in some women, but not in all. And what is there any studies on the training effect in athletes? Very few. This is the first one that was reported. 3 nulliparous volleyball players. They did peripheral muscle training, plus a lot of other things, electrical stimulation, cones, you name it, bladder training, everything. 3 months, and they reported that all of them were cured. As this is a very, very bad design, of course, to say anything about effect. Case series of 7 sport students, again, not a very high quality research design. 6 of 7 reported to be cured or significantly improved, and they also improved the pelvic floor muscle strength. And then this study pre-post test again, so number was 18 local sport clubs. They didn't find any effect of training them. And then there's 1 RCT on 32 volleyball players from Brazil, and pelvic muscle training was done for 3 months, and it was 30 contractions per day plus pre-contracting before they were coughing or doing abdominal exercises, compared to only giving them a pamphlet on information. And they did find a significant difference in improvement in the both pad tests and frequency of leakage in the training group. But again, this is not a very high quality RCT, and the exercises are not very well described. So this is all we have when it comes to treating women who are exercising. And the big question is, when can women resume strenuous physical activity after childbirth? The problem with this question is, what is strenuous exercises and what is physical activity? Because that really depends on what you are doing. So very difficult to find out. And what about the fitness before pregnancy? Because that also have an influence on what you can do and how soon you can start to exercise and what sort of exercises you can do afterwards. So in Norway, now we are in for the Winter Olympics. This is Marit Bjørgen. She is the best skier in Norway. She got pregnant after the last Olympics, and she was followed in Norway. She is here exercising on skiing, and skiing, you know, is low impact, cross-country skiing. This is training, so she could have a great risk of falling on doing that, but still she was exercising a lot. And during that time, we were very lucky to be asked to have this IOC consensus meeting in Lausanne, and I was really happy to be asked to be sharing this session, and we collected all these international researchers interested in this area. And stayed 3 days at the Olympic Center in Lausanne, trying to go through all the literature in this area. And this has been published in the British Journal of Sport Medicine. 4 articles so far, and the 5th is coming any day now, I hope. And it was really difficult to conclude because there are so few studies in the athletes. So when can they start? We cannot say. But there has been a return to sport conference in sport physiotherapy in 2016, and they did a very wise division into what we are talking about, because one thing is return to participation, so start walking, start doing things, then return to your sport, which was for Marit would be the cross country. When could she do that? Well, I can tell she started the day after she given birth, so no problem. But there was a problem. I'm not going to talk about that now. Well, I can say because she actually had 2 fractures to her pelvis, and that was obviously because she had not enough nutrition compared to what she was doing. She's not menstruating, of course, and because she was breastfeeding, and so this was really going directly onto her bone density, really bad. She was not followed good enough on that, but anyway. But then returned to performance, and she returned to performance 2 months after her childbirth, which was also too early for her. But there is scant evidence for return to sport in elite athletes, and we need prospective cohort studies in this area to follow them, because it's not going to be possible to do any randomized controlled trials in elite athletes. First of all, they are not getting pregnant at the same time. So you have one from New Zealand this year, you have two from Australia next year, and so you know, we need to follow them and see what happens. However, to end up, we are facing an aging population. In Europe, in 2050, 25% will be more than 75 years, and in Italy, 35%. In 2050, 2.2 million in the world will be more than 100 years old. And there is a feminization of this because, unfortunately, the men still dies earlier than the females. So we will have a lot of females who will be older. And there will be a great inter-individual heterogeneity. Some they will be very frail and disabled, but some will be very fit. And urinary incontinence is a significant cause of disability and dependency. Hence, prevention and early treatment is the best cure. Therefore, we need to really establish good regimes for pelvic floor muscle training to prevent and treat this condition in all females who needs this. So to conclude, strenuous exercise is likely to unmask urinary incontinence, because if you're sitting like we are here now, you're not going to leak. If you have a cold once a year, maybe you're leaking through that, but if you are exercising every day, the more you exercise, the more you are exposed to increase in intra-abdominal pressure, and it may unmask that you have this condition. It doesn't cause the condition, but it unmasks the condition. Mild to moderate exercise may be beneficial if the pelvic floor muscles co-contract, but only if they co-contract. There's some evidence that strenuous exercise may cause pelvic floor dysfunction, but today there is strong evidence for pelvic floor muscle training to treat stress urinary incontinence and pelvic organ prolapse in the general population. Hundreds of RCTs, high quality, level 1A evidence that this can be used both in treatment and in prevention. So this is what we should do. This is from my exercise class, and I train these women general exercise aerobic fitness class. Most of them have been with me for 30 years now. They train the pelvic floor muscle twice a week during this class. I mean, the class is about everything, but we have one session of pelvic floor muscle training. This can be done in all exercise classes for women if the instructors are willing to do that. I have not met a lot of willingness from the instructors because they think it's odd, it's about sex, it's about, you know, they don't dare to say where it is. So there is a lot of resistance from the fitness industry to do that, but it's possible to do it. We need much more research in the heavy exertion as an etiology for problems with the pelvic floor. Prevention and treatments in exercises and elite athletes. You saw the 3-4 studies that we have. It's really not much. And what about return to sport after childbirth? That's the big question, and a very difficult question to answer as a scientist, I would say. So thank you so much for the attention.
Thank you very much. Thank you for spending your time. So, open for questions. Yeah.
Do you think there'd be a problem with ethics if you did ask women to return to strenuous exercise after childbirth, say at a set time, because you might hypothesize that they could worsen their symptoms or give themselves a prolapse?
I don't. Yeah.
A problem with ethics?
I don't think we could do that. At least in Norway, we will not be allowed to do it because there is so much theory telling that it may be. So I don't think we can do it. No, I think we better go this line that we are working on here to try to see what the exercises are doing to the pelvic floor, because these studies that I referred to, they just looked at the intra-abdominal pressure, it didn't look at the co-contraction of the pelvic floor, which is the main thing, because I don't care if it's a big intra-abdominal pressure, if the pelvic floor is contracting, that's fine. Yeah.
Yeah, we'll get there.
Yeah, I hope so.
So great talk, by the way. I think this is really interesting and obviously important research. So I was thinking of a hypothesis as you were presenting some of this, of sort of what's the mechanism for athletes having increased leaking. And I'm wondering if it's what's going on with athletes is that they're strengthening all of the muscles in their body, but not necessarily pelvic floor muscles specifically. So you're basically increasing the ability to create intra-abdominal pressure through muscle strength, through the ability to generate large forces with your abdominal muscles, with your lower limb muscles. And so could it be that athletes are getting stronger and stronger, but not necessarily in the pelvic floor? And so I guess would that motivate training, from a young age, having some kind of, some research background to motivate with young athletes having specific pelvic floor muscle training? Does that make sense?
That's a very good question. That's my dream study, and I will have a new PhD candidate now, and we will try to do this in weightlifters and in gymnasts.
Okay,
the
so
problem
doing pelvic floor muscle training
in one group and not in the other.
I see.
This is quite problematic because you have to do cluster randomization, because you can't take, you're going to train but not you, and you're working together. It's really hard to do that. So I don't know really how to manage. It's easier with the weightlifters, but and the gymnasts are very young, so 12 to 16, so they haven't had any intercourse, most of them, and they don't even menstruate, so it's hard to really measure the pelvic floor muscles. So I don't know how to do it, but I'll try to get there, because I think that it's possible to train them, but I don't know it is, because if you look at the impact when the gymnast is landing on the beam, it's 1 foot or 2 foot, and it's like that. It's really, really strong, and so they need much stronger muscles than what we do.
Right, yeah.
So I don't know yet, but I hope that I can answer that question in some years.
Anything else?
You had long-term prevalence on urinary incontinence in athletes. Was there anything on prolapse?
No, and I've only been able to see this one study from Middlecoff, was it? Yes, that looked into prolapse. So the prevalence was 5%, and I haven't seen any other studies on the athletes on that. So I would really like also to look into the marathon runners, because that's one of the hypotheses that they may, run into a prolapse.
There's quite a bit on social media about how it's fine to run in your 3rd trimester at 37 weeks. Have you seen anything on the effects of that pressure on the pelvic floor?
No. But I mean, when we looked at the exercises in our study, but that was, it was regular Norwegian women, first child, and exercising 3 times a week or more. They were more open, but they didn't have any more prolapse or any other thing, and it didn't affect their childbirth either. So it was, it doesn't seem to influence them at that level, but that's something very different from being a gymnast, or, well, the gymnast will not be in this group, because they don't give birth when they're 16. So anyway, but look at the marathon runners then. We don't know if it's too much.
So on that note, I thought it was interesting that the 2 groups that you see a lot of leaking are weightlifters and marathon runners, because obviously the magnitude of the loads is extremely high in weightlifters, but really not all that high in the marathoners. So I'm thinking, so with marathoners you have very high frequency, low loading, and with weightlifters you have very high magnitude, low frequency. Do you hypothesize there to be, or what mechanisms do you think could be at play in terms of the high frequency loading, high frequency, low magnitude versus high magnitude, low frequency, and how do you deal with that in pelvic floor training?
I don't know. I would like to know. I don't know. But I think also the marathon runners, they report that they leak at the end of the marathon. And I also heard, fatigue. Yeah. And what they are doing is, so when they are drinking, when they take the drinking bottle, they pull it down there so it's not going to see that they are leaking. So they do all these
Tricks.
tricks. Yeah. But we don't really have good data on the weightlifters. So I started some studies on the strength lifters. That's going, up here. And we had the world champion at that time in our university. She had extremely strong muscles, but she had trained the muscles because she said, well, I feel that if I'm going to do a very good lifting, I need to close my pelvic floor because then I can increase the intra-abdominal pressure. So she had trained, but I don't know about the others. Well, so that's again what we should do. We have to assess the pelvic floor muscles and see if they are different.
I have a very different kind of question.
Yeah.
With all that you have achieved and all the studies that you run, how in the hell do you find time to have a fitness group?
Twice a week. That's what keep me going, Without exercises, I could not have done any of this. So that I think is very important. I was head of the university and head of the University of Oslo. He said to me the first day when I was talking to him, don't stop exercising. It's the only thing that will not make you going crazy during these 4 years. And it was true. So no, I just keep going because it's so important. I can't live without it. Yeah.
Take home message, guys.
Yeah.
Okay, thank you very much.